Power now depends on the possession of information. A statement I often see flying around modern discourse is, nothing makes sense anymore. A great many people now feel that the world is incomprehensible and that no matter how hard they try, they cannot figure out what is true and what is false. But this is a huge problem because, as we shall see, an awful lot hinges on people being able to make sense of the world they inhabit. So this is arguably one of the most important issues of today. One thinker who has tackled this problem is the Korean-German philosopher Byung-Chul Han. In his book Infocracy, he explores the nuances of how information is disseminated in the modern age, and the potentially disastrous effects of this. Get ready to learn the danger of having too much information, how social media is making us all crazier, and whether we have killed truth itself. As always, bear in mind that this is an enormous topic and I'm just giving one perspective on it. I'll be referencing Han, along with a lot of other thinkers, to try and explain his particular philosophical analysis of this phenomenon, but this is by no means the final word on the issue, and I hope that it can largely be the starting point for your own thinking. But let's begin with perhaps the most obvious problem with our information ecosystem, that there is just too much of it. 1. Information, time, and action. In the mid-20th century, the term information overload was coined to describe the situation where the amount of information a decision-maker has is so far in excess of what they can process or understand that it actually impairs their decision-making process. We can think of this as analogous to what happens with a computer. If I was using a pretty low-end laptop to run my incredibly modded version of Skyrim, then that machine would stall and stutter and maybe even crash. The amount of information it's being expected to process is just too much, and as a result, it can't really do anything. And Han falls into a long tradition of philosophers concerned that a similar thing is happening to us on the individual level. This fear was raised specifically to do with the internet by the philosopher Hubert Dreyfus all the way back in 1999. Drawing heavily from Kierkegaard, Dreyfus suggests that the internet could bring about a totally dispassionate relationship between us and information. By passion here, he does not mean some kind of emotional dysregulation, but instead the ability for information to then translate into committed action. For Dreyfus and Kierkegaard, understanding, and thus action, is only really possible if we are given just the right amount of information structured in a way that makes it understandable or processable. In some ways, this is a rather obvious point. If I were to present you with a perfectly ordinary English sentence, but with the words in the wrong order, it would be almost impossible to make sense of what it meant. However, according to thinkers like Han, Dreyfus, and Kierkegaard, this structure does not just need to be linguistic, but it must also indicate which information is valuable or relevant, and which is not. Han points out that without an idea of what information is important and what information is true, it becomes much more difficult to understand anything at all. It means there is no data that we can just safely ignore, and instead we are forced to conduct the prioritization and verification process for ourselves. This is resource intensive, and we might not even be best placed to carry out this task if the information is far outside our area of prior knowledge. Han suggests that any way of presenting information comes ready-laden with certain values, since, if nothing else, the author has had to choose what to include and what to leave out in their presentation. But if there is simply a deluge of information by a whole bunch of different authors, each with their own individual priorities and very little way to tell which is best placed to help us, then we can begin to drown in the sheer amount of things to learn, delaying action over and over again until we are overcome with analysis paralysis. And lest you think this idea about the value-ladenness of information is simply the result of Han's left-wing position, the very same point is made by none other than Jordan Peterson in the preface to his newest book, and in fact it seems to form the cornerstone of his own more conservative philosophy. I will be giving a full review of that book later in this month, so do stick around for that. This process of understanding becomes even more difficult when information dissemination is primarily geared not towards truth or even utility, but rather towards attention and retention. Content that makes you angry or disgusted or scared is often going to be compelling regardless of its truth or usefulness to you. This is just what performs well in social media algorithms. To revisit Kierkegaard and Dreyfus, they suggest that such proliferation of information works directly against a sincere engagement with the content of that information. Confronted with far too much to sort through, we begin to gently accept that we will not be able to figure out what's actually the case, so we settle for other goals. Kierkegaard argues that many of us will become kind of passive spectators, who are much more interested in commentating on the world than trying to change it or take decisive action in it. Though I do recognise I'm throwing stones from a very glass house here. Deprived of the ability to establish facts, we instead aim for proxy metrics. We try to appear clever or witty or sardonic. In essence, this incentivizes the permanent adoption of an ironic mode of speech. If there is too much information to sift through, such that it becomes almost impossible to form a confident opinion on something, then the only safe position to hold is that of the eternal critic. After all, to criticize something, you don't need to take a definite stance yourself, but merely have a go at someone else's. I'm not saying there is no place for critique, as it is a huge part of what could potentially allow us to evaluate information. But for Kierkegaard, when there is endless information being produced without much thought given to its quality or its relevance, endlessly being criticized semi-ironically by people whose main goal is just to look clever, then we end up with information that is entirely divorced from either action or individual people making sense of the world. It all just becomes fodder for coffee table talk and opinion columns. And Han thinks this also relates to the pace of information. He points out that we can focus on information for significantly less time if there is a very high turnover rate for it. For example, when we had daily newspapers, information was spread in 1 or 2 short bursts in the day, and this limited the rate at which topics could fall in and out of public consciousness. At the very least, a story would have to live for a day, with many persisting far longer. However, with the medium of information transfer increasingly being social media, the time which information remains worth knowing does shrink considerably. Personally, I think this does have some real benefits. It means that we can access the changes in a story very quickly in the way that simply would not be possible in a newspaper age. It also allows the information to be accessed by almost anyone without the need to purchase a newspaper each day. But these benefits do come with a cost. Han argues that to truly process information and translate it into action, or even more drastically, wisdom, takes a lot of time and a lot of focused thought. We must filter out all the irrelevancies, refine it in a way that is particularly pertinent to us, and fit it in with the rest of our deeply held beliefs. At the very extreme end of this scale, monks may meditate on a particular passage of the Bible or a particular sutta for days or even months. But none of this slow reflection is going to be possible if the story will be forgotten about in less than an hour. At most, it becomes a conversational tidbit, and at worst, the information is simply of no use to anyone. It's produced for its own sake just to put ads underneath it. Though again, given that I'm a YouTuber, I do appreciate the irony in me saying that. For Han, the end result of this is that we get a huge increase in the quantity of information, since there's a large profit motive to simply throwing information out there. But we lose much of our ability to turn that information into something valuable for us. To use a rather unpleasant image, it's a bit like we're being force-fed to the point of vomiting while never getting the chance to fully digest anything. And do let me know to what extent this notion of an information deluge chimes with your own personal experience. However, this is only the beginning of Han's critique. Because while we may not be getting the most out of the information we consume, and many of us may end up just bewildered by it, this does not mean that the information ecosystem leaves us unaffected, or that it does not change our opinions. And Han is concerned that if we're not too careful, this could have disastrous effects on societal cohesion. If you want to help me make more videos like this, then please consider supporting me on Patreon, as I would really appreciate it. The link is in the description. 2. Debate, society, and logic. As I've talked about many times on the channel, a large number of 19th century thinkers became incredibly stressed about the decline of religion in Europe. Even atheistic philosophers like Nietzsche and especially Schopenhauer thought that without religious belief there is a chance that our civilizations would collapse, since they'd be deprived of a shared set of values that we could all rally behind. Arguably, this worry was particularly pronounced in Germany, since it was such a young country and still lacking a firm national identity. The composer Richard Wagner was so worried about this that he tried to create such an identity using his music. The general idea here is both clear and somewhat intuitive. If there are fundamental disagreements about values within a community, that community will find it increasingly difficult to coordinate itself, and thus is far more likely to just implode. Or, to quote the US President Abraham Lincoln, who in turn was quoting the Bible, "A house divided against itself cannot stand." In a similar vein, there has been a lot of talk in recent years about how social media algorithms can cause us to live in information bubbles isolated from one another. And while the nuances of this point have been debated back and forth, Han wants to look at the issue from a different but related angle. He talks about how our current information ecosystem could potentially make our views of reality so radically different from one another's that it becomes increasingly difficult to have conversations with one another, and how this could become an incredibly serious problem, especially in liberal democracies. Upon closer inspection, this issue could occur both with definitions and with beliefs. But first, some background. The English philosopher A.J. Ayer, just like many analytic philosophers of his day, held that discussion could only take place if everyone involved had already agreed upon certain definitions. Otherwise, the whole conversation will be baffling and unproductive. This is also a theme of much of Wittgenstein's writings, both his early ones and his later ones, where he often viewed philosophical disagreements as confusions about language that would be solved upon closer examination of the language's logical structure in his earlier work, or their use in language games in his later work. Either way, a theme emerges. If there is not shared agreement over how words are used, then communication can quickly break down. While there has been much philosophical ink spilled about this, it's also a reasonably simple point to demonstrate. If you ever stop and watch people have an argument, then you'll notice they often will be using entirely different definitions for the same words. One person will say right to mean in accordance with God's commandments, while another person will use the same term to mean does the greatest good for the greatest number. To one person, euthanasia conjures up an image of someone passing away painlessly and contentedly in their sleep, while to another person, it also includes cases of someone being pressured into ending their own life. In such a situation, it's obvious that no agreement is likely to be reached because the two parties are effectively talking past one another. They are having parallel conversations, and the fact they think they're having a reciprocal discussion is illusory. In other words, disagreements about facts can only occur against a backdrop of agreement about definitions. It's one of the reasons why Socrates spends so long talking about them in Plato's dialogues. But separate from definitions, Han points out that sensible disagreements about facts or ideas at one level also require agreement about some other facts and ideas at a higher level in order to come to a sensible resolution. This idea sounds more difficult than it is, but the progress of scientific inquiry is actually a very good example of this. The inimitable physicist Richard Feynman used to say that the beauty of science is that everyone can vehemently disagree about what the result of an experiment will be. But once the experiment is carried out, the disagreement can then be resolved to a certain extent. At one level, there was a dispute, but at a higher order level, there was agreement about how that dispute would be settled. Following Habermas, Han calls this living in the same life world, but we can just think of it as taking the same base assumptions for granted, and then using those assumptions in disagreements. To use a more straightforwardly political example, if two people agree that the elections in their country are free and fair, then they have a point of agreement from which to resolve disputes. Once an election result rolls in, they can both respect that, regardless of what they thought of the candidates. Whereas if one or both parties do not believe that the elections were free and fair, then votes can no longer resolve disputes between these two people. For Han, these shared agreements are essentially what allows us to disagree without violence. While we may hold different positions at one level, we both respect a higher order set of beliefs by which we test those positions, and all agree to respect the outcome. The point here is not necessarily that it makes everyone agree, because it most certainly does not, but rather that it allows people to agree to disagree. And agreeing to disagree is pretty handy if you want a society of more than about 10 people. Well, a democratic one, that is. Han's worry is that as our information diets are increasingly shaped by algorithms that are tailored directly to us, we will potentially lose this backdrop of shared agreement that facilitates productive discussions about subjects like politics. If we only view content that agrees with us, and then only see the most ridiculous and over-the-top aspects of the content that disagrees with us, then we start to lose even the most basic scraps of shared ground that we can work from. Ultimately, Han thinks this is only worsening an already existent human tendency. We are all prone to confirmation bias, tribal loyalties, and so on, but the vast amount of information online allows us to curate our own world in accordance with these biases in a way that we simply could not do before. In theory, it's now possible for us to only watch content that reinforces our own views, only talk to people who agree with us, and end up with a specially tailored set of self-evident facts, we believe, which bears no resemblance to the set of facts that those who disagree with us do. And Han says, even if we are confronted with information that disagrees with our worldview, we can find it very easy to dismiss. As he puts it, the tribalism of both right-wing and left-wing identity politics divides and polarizes society. It turns identity into a protective shield or fortress that repels any kind of otherness. Those familiar with Han's philosophy may recognize this concept of otherness from much of his other work. For Han, the trouble is that all of this erodes our ability to solve disagreements using words and deliberation. If we end up in a situation where people genuinely feel they have nothing in common with the other side, that their opponents are simply mad and do not have any kind of reason or cause behind their beliefs, if there is nothing both sides can turn to and respect, no facts they can agree on, then there is a risk that we cease to treat one another as rational, deliberative agents. At this point, Han thinks there's a real danger that people will use violence or coercion more and more to resolve disputes. And on that note, I want to turn to Han's concerns about how our infocratic landscape may begin to view us as human beings, and how we can be manipulated by the power of data. 3. The human tool. One of the most public concerns about the flow of information is the disproportionate amount of power given to the person or people who control it. To a certain extent, this has always been the case. While people did have independent theological reasons for wanting to prevent the Bible's translation from Latin into English and German, it was also undeniably politically expedient for the church to control access to what was seen as the revealed truth of God. Likewise, concerns over who owns media companies and what they do with them have been raised time and time again for the past 50 years or so. However, for Han, the age of endless information brings with it its own challenges about information control, because he thinks we are increasingly viewing human beings as merely sources and victims of data. One of the key values throughout Han's work is autonomy. That is, the ability to make uncompromised decisions based on our wills and our rationality. And ultimately, he worries that a certain attitude towards data-driven decision-making, especially at the political level, is a potential threat to this autonomy. This is quite a complex and incredibly controversial argument. I certainly don't know how far I agree with it. But it is interesting, so I think it's worth exploring. Firstly, I want to note that Han does not dispute the value of having more data in a whole heap of situations. It allows you to make predictions you otherwise could not, inform your decisions, and potentially do an awful lot of good. However, he is worried that in the haze of all of this brilliant stuff we can do by tracking correlations, we might end up forgetting that our decisions do not just fall out of algorithms, and that we are making decisions based on the information we have, rather than the information just making the decision for itself. Han suggests that one troubling thing about simply tracking correlations in large datasets is that we forget that such datasets are not necessarily value neutral. For one thing, at some level, something, be it a human or an algorithm, will have to decide what data to collect and what to leave. This decision about what's important to record and process is not just a descriptive one, but a value-based one. The characterization of a decision being just what the data says often relies on ignoring all of the assumptions built into the collection, processing, and interpretation of this data. In a business context, this is actually something the advertising executive Rory Sutherland has heavily criticized, suggesting that the theories used to interpret data in a lot of boardrooms is often far too narrow. At points, Han seems to think one danger in just following the data is that we will fail to question the underlying assumptions at play, which can then lead to undesirable outcomes. Or, to put it bluntly, if you put poor data in, then you'll get poor data out. Interestingly, we have already seen this in some machine learning algorithms, which have on occasion ended up unfairly discriminating in hiring processes because of the datasets they've been trained on. For Han, it is imperative that we have humans thinking and reflecting about these data-driven decisions. Certainly not to ignore data, but just to keep an eye on it. Additionally, to bring this back to how the modern world can sometimes seem baffling, it is arguably very important that the rationale behind decision-making, especially at a governmental level, still remains explicable to us as the general populace. Otherwise, again, it becomes very difficult for us to make sense of the world we inhabit. However, Han is also worried about the attitude we may begin to take towards us as humans as we prioritize data-driven decision-making over and above concerns about human autonomy. Han points to the claims of people he calls dataists, who suggest that eventually we'll be able to predict all human behavior simply by charting correlations in datasets. Interestingly, whether or not this is true, Han is primarily concerned about how this view of humans would affect the way that we are treated and how we treat one another. Whether we're autonomous beings or deterministic algorithms, or indeed whether these positions are compatible, Han thinks that we gain an awful lot pragmatically by treating us as if we truly are autonomous. He echoes the thoughts of someone like Dostoevsky, who said that we need to think of ourselves as free on some level in order to be fulfilled. And at a societal level, Han considers it dangerous for those who set government policy to stop thinking of us as autonomous creatures. At a sort of metaphysical level, this makes sense given Han's Catholic background, but as a pragmatic point, this does not require a religious framework at all. Similar to Schopenhauer, who asked, even if God doesn't exist, what does the idea of God do societally? Han wants to ask, even if we can be perfectly predicted by algorithms, is there a high cost to actually trying to do this or viewing humans in this way? For Han, along with the idea of humans as autonomous beings comes the notion of political rights, rights to privacy, respect for agency, and so much more. He seems to think that if we slowly stop treating humans as if we are autonomous, there is a danger that these other important assumptions go out the window as well. And there are good reasons to at least consider this position. After all, as Plato took pains to argue over 2,000 years ago, sometimes believing something false can still have huge societal benefits, and sometimes the truth is just too ugly or potentially destructive to share. Lastly, Han worries about who exactly gets to own and control this data. Whether the dataist position is right about the total predictability of human behavior, they are certainly right that a large proportion of human behavior just is predictable. And this being the case, whoever has access to the most data about the most people then has a disproportionate amount of power over those people that they can now just predict. In some ways, we're very fortunate that at the moment this power is largely used to sell us stuff. But the same power could be used to shift public opinion on socio-economic issues or simply spread division. In fact, some people argue it already has been used for these things. As Han says at the beginning of his book, sovereign is he who has control over the information. Being able to predict someone's behavior and knowing exactly how to persuade and convince them is a pretty insidious form of power. Unlike direct coercion or the use of threats, it does not even allow the person who's being controlled the dignity of resistance. It instead turns their very minds to advantage, like a sort of demonic possession for the modern age. And it can do this without even making the agent irrational. They are simply responding to the best information that they have, and who can blame them? Or I should say, who can blame us, since we are possibly in this position. But lastly, Han brings all of these points together in his final essay, where he discusses the end result of this particular information landscape: the neutering of truth itself. 4. Declawing the truth. In recent years, much has been made of the idea that we are living in a post-truth world. But I sometimes see people take this to mean that truth has ceased to exist, or that material reality has somehow died. But I think this is a mistake. In Han's view, it is certainly not that there is no longer any truth, but rather that what is true is slowly becoming disconnected from the factors at play in discussion and discourse. In other words, truth is not dead, it's just been chemically castrated. Now, in order to talk about this, we're going to have to use phrases like the social construction of truth. But don't panic, neither I nor Han has gone off the deep end and thinks that there's no such thing as truth anymore. What Han means by this is not the mere idea of facts being true, that is, certain statements corresponding to states of affairs in the external world, but rather the social value that is placed on a given statement being true. For example, let's assume we are both reasonable people and we are engaged in a debate. If I find out that my position is false and yours is true, then ideally there is an immense and very handy social pressure for me to abandon my position and accept yours. If I do not do this in a public arena, we would like to think I would be socially censured for it. We would hope that I'd be called stubborn or stupid, which incidentally are not inappropriate labels for me in any case. But this value we place on truth is technically optional. Again, this can sound worryingly relativist, but an example will help bring it down to earth. For instance, say you were a member of Stalin's inner circle in 1947. In this situation, you are unlikely to question what Stalin suggests, even if you know that it rests on a false premise. Here, the value of getting the boss's approval has superseded the value of truth, due to the consequences of pissing Stalin off being a lot more dire than simply telling a lie or letting one slide. Indeed, this is often touted as one of the crowning strengths of a liberal democracy. They are supposedly meant to allow for the free flow of true information without anyone fearing they'll be thrown in prison or executed if they tell an uncomfortable truth. I also want to note here that with the exception of any purported noble lies, it is just incredibly useful to socially value truth. Because having as accurate as possible a picture of the state of the material world is very useful when you want to interact with that world. Indeed, when Han talks about the dangers of viewing us as anything other than autonomous agents, this is because he is worried about people being able to interact successfully with our decision-making in insidious ways. Han suggests that all of the factors we've already looked at have subtly lowered the social value of truth, and we should be very careful about allowing it to lower any further. This lack of regard for truth is what Han calls the new nihilism, and he thinks we should all be rather worried about it. This point very much links back with what we were talking about in sections 1 and 2 about the proliferation and curation of information allowing people to live with wildly divergent pictures of what is the case. This effectively creates a large number of internally coherent narratives which different people can check any incoming claims against. To draw upon the work of W. V. Quine and Wittgenstein, when we humans are confronted with a potential new belief, we can only check it against all of the other things we already believe to a stronger degree. If it fits with them, or better yet, is supported by them, then we feel much more comfortable adopting it, whereas if it does not, then we find it much easier to reject. This can sound abstract, but it's really rather intuitive. If you try to tell me that you saw an angel last week, then you'll have a very hard time convincing me, since I'm an atheist. But if you were to tell a devout Catholic the same claim, you would probably have a much easier time making them believe you, since it fits much better with their pre-existing web of beliefs. The trouble with large discrepancies in what people think is true, even at fundamental levels, is that then social value is not just held by the capital T truth, but rather by these individual narratives that are believed to be true by different sets of people. Again, think back to the example of scientific inquiry. If scientists did not just differ in what they believed, but each individual scientist had their own idea of how to separate fact from fiction, then scientific progress would become borderline impossible. Han is concerned that we're increasingly devaluing truth as a regulative factor in our discourse, and thus encouraging what Harry Frankfurt would call bullshit. That is, statements which are characterized not by truth or falsity, but by a total lack of concern for what is true or false on the part of the speaker. We see this in common usage. When people call politicians bullshitters, they are often accusing them of just saying whatever they feel they need to get elected or to get positive press coverage, regardless of what is actually the case. This is just the sort of thing Han is worried will become the dominant mode of discourse in politics or wider society. It is not that things will no longer be true or false, it's just that we will not care either way anymore unless it's a specific situation where the truth of a matter forces itself upon us. It's very difficult to not believe in rocks when one has just hit you in the face, but we want to believe in the rock before that point specifically so it doesn't hit us in the face. And for Han, this devaluing of truth comes with real dangers. For one thing, it massively widens the set of claims that someone can make and not attract social censure. If there is so much information that we cannot figure out what is actually true, then the door is open for someone to make truly absurd claims, and the most we can do is shrug our shoulders about it. After all, we're no longer in a position to prove them wrong because we don't know what the hell is going on either. And if the health of a democracy relies on as many people believing as many relevant truths as possible, then this puts us in some real trouble. Additionally, this in turn worsens the problem of proliferating information, and the whole thing becomes a baffling vicious cycle. And according to Han, this damage cascades outwards. Without shared ideas about truth, it's very difficult to form shared narratives, and without shared narratives, it's very difficult for societies to have a shared orientation that most people within that society can agree on. And this all ultimately comes together in an information tapestry to create that sense of confusion that we talked about at the opening of this video. With too much information to process, too many narratives to follow, and too much fragmentation over what is true, it becomes increasingly difficult to trust anything at all. So is it any wonder that we end up confused and aimless? In classic fashion, Han does not really explore solutions to this in his work, and I actually think coming up with solutions here would be incredibly difficult. After all, while the proliferation of narratives can be inconvenient and confusing, attempting to control narratives, constrain what can and cannot be said, and legislate over what people can believe is true begins to sound really quite authoritarian. But this is also what makes this issue so fascinating. It raises the question, how do we want to manage information in an age where anyone can make any claim they fancy and potentially reach millions without falling into the opposite problem of having the flow of information controlled by a few organizations who then have the power to shape anything they want? For Han, the answer is not clear. But given what he says in his book, he thinks we're currently getting the worst of both worlds. And then it is worth us asking, 1, is he right? And 2, if he is, what can be done about it? Both individually and at the level of our societies. But if you want to examine some of Han's views further, then click here to explore his work, The Transparency Society, which deals with the downsides of putting our entire lives on display. I hope you enjoyed this video and have a wonderful day.